Hello, this is Darren Pulsifer, Chief Solution Architect of Public Sector at Intel, and welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. On today's episode, Zero Trust Principles with Senior Security Architect Dave Marcus and returning guest Dr. Anna Scott. Dave, Anna, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I should say, Anna, welcome back to the show, but you're like almost a regular on the show, Anna. And it's good to have you back again. But Dave, you're new. We know nothing about you, Dave. My guests know nothing about you. So let's hear a little bit about who is Dave Marcus and why are we talking to you today?
Sure. I'm actually a rehire. So I recently just came back to Intel. In the last 9 months or so. I was originally part of the McAfee acquisition, so I actually worked for Intel for several years after Intel had acquired McAfee. I was part of the team that developed or was developing a technology called Deep Defender, which was an integrated technology that Intel and McAfee was developing at the same time. And I've been in cybersecurity for upwards of 20 years, dealing with malware threats, and then later developing threat intelligence and full intelligence. So been in the space for quite a while, seen it from a very varied perspectives from the endpoint to the network, and lately just kind of working on putting it all together from a zero trust and platform perspective.
Well, Dave, welcome back to Intel, and then also, I'm glad we have a real security person because Anna and I we kind of fake it because we haven't been in the trenches around security like you have.
Correct.
So we get to sit in our ivory architect towers and dream up new architectures that are highly secure, or at least we think. Now we have a real person here.
It all works on paper, doesn't it? It's all perfect on that architectural piece of paper until a user has to do something, right? And that's when it all falls apart.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And today we're talking about real paper architectures today, because we're going to talk about the principles of zero trust, which come out of work that NSA did and then CISA has done. Should we just dive into it? Let's just plow into it.
I think that would be great.
That's great.
All right. So there are, and they just added recently another pillar on it was 5 pillars. Now it's 6 pillars, but one's a foundation. But let's go over those real quick. We've got workforce security, device security, network, data, and then visibility and analytics, and then automation underneath the covers, right? The visibility and analytics and automation are kind of the
and there's one more that's in the CISA zero trust maturity model, which is orchestration. I'm sorry, did I say orchestration? What I really meant was governance.
Governance, okay.
So they're essentially bringing automation and orchestration as a single topic or a single underlying foundational requirement. And then governance is the next one. And then for some folks, we'll use the word identity instead of workforce. So correct. Just to say those are interchangeable for us. But I think identity I see in a few more places.
So, philosophically, Dave, you've been around a long time in security.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't these just the general principles of really good security hygiene anyway? And they just kind of operationalize it, or they've kind of standardized it? I don't know. What's the right word, Dave?
So yes and no. If you actually look at, if you take zero trust terminology, zero trust out of the mix, there's nothing new actually in there. There's network security, endpoint security, yada, 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 visibility, things like that. Where zero trust flips things on the head is the fundamental principle of trust nothing, verify everything. That's the difference. So in the zero trust world, you trust nothing and verify everything continually all the time. That's different than the walled garden paradigm of I'm just going to take all my sensitive stuff and put it in the walled garden, and I'm just going to put up a firewall and put some rules in the firewall. Zero trust flips the model by trust nothing and trust no one, verify everything, verify everyone, and do it continually.
Okay, you guys, just so my listeners, you can buy a Trust No One, Verify Everyone t-shirt from our website, embracingdigital.org. I got to make some money somehow with this podcast. So I actually love this, right? Trust no one, verify
Yep,
continuously. Um,
continuously. And that's actually one of the more complicated. I mean, we're kind of jumping ahead here, but pillar number 6, like Anna was talking about, the whole visibility and analytics thing, and then the orchestration and automation part is actually extraordinarily complicated. So it's not just I log on once and then I am granted access to the one thing that I need. That's a small part of it architecturally. The point is to continually say and continually prove who I am and that I'm allowed to continually access that particular resource for very specific reasons. So when you look at the identity portion that Anna also talked about, it's not just who you are. It's not just a user logon and a user token. It's actually a full Kipling policy. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. That is what's supposed to go into identity, not just username, password, and token, but where's the device? What's the policy? What am I supposed to be accessing? Do I have the right job title? Am I logging in from a certain part of the world? Am I logging in off business hours? All those things are supposed to go into identity. So the monitoring aspect has to take all those things into account there.
okay, so identity, I'm glad we brought up because we just dove right into the first pillar, identity. And I have one question around that. You said the Kipling model, which I get, right? Because in the past, it's who are you and a password,
Yep.
right? And then people go, oh, well, multi-factor authentication, right? So a password and then something else, or something you know and something you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Multi-factor type. But you're saying there's even more than that. Where are you from? And who are, there, all those things. Is there a temporal aspect to this as well? Like how long do I have access to an asset?
There
Is
can
that
be.
in the Kipling model? Because I've heard this concept of temporal. My identity is only good for a certain period of time.
That's going to depend upon the policy that the asset management side is trying to enforce, or the segmentation portion of it is trying to enforce. So it can be, meaning I'm just granting you access to, I'm just making this up, a web server and a web app for an hour, and after an hour, your login goes away or your access goes away. So those types of things can be taken into account when you get into the other aspects of identity management, the kind of the whens and the hows and the how often and the locations. So for instance, Anna and myself, we're Intel employees. We have high levels of access because of what we do for Intel. Let's say my user credentials and my login is correct, but all of a sudden I'm logging in from a part of the world I've never logged into before. That's a problem. So you see what I mean? So depending upon how you're implementing that MFA, someone could have stolen my username, my credentials, and my token and legitimately logged in if the policy and the verification doesn't take into account all those other aspects of the Kiplinger policy. Make sense?
Yeah, no.
And this might be a good point to say, like, one of the key ways that the zero trust architectures are going to be implemented is they really are around those policy enforcement points. And so bringing up the idea of policy, it's like,
Yep.
there's the goal of what you're trying to achieve with trust nobody, verify continually, right, or verify in real time. But then there is the policy that is going to be key to really
Yep.
setting that up and making that how your system is really working. So if you're reading through those very detailed descriptions from the DoD and from NIST with respect to what a zero trust architecture looks like, you'll see PEPs all over the place with that.
Yep.
Which are the
Spot on.
policy enforcement points.
All right. So PEP. I'm glad you said PEP, policy enforcement point.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying
Our
that
first
this is
acronym. Our first acronym.
our first
of this
acronym.
podcast.
That's right.
There's more. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there'll be a lot more. So, but this
Oh, yeah.
is really important because the PEP concept is critical to zero trust because
Yes.
before you just did your policy enforcement on the walled garden. That was the only place
Correct.
she cared about,
Mhm.
right? So there was one point. And so the difference in a zero trust architecture is I've got several of these PEP points inside the architecture, inside the wall garden, if you still have one. Um, it's more like you said, trust no one, right?
Sure.
Well,
And
and
I
it'll
continue.
go across, we've only talked about identity so far, but the same is true with network, right? The whole idea of, hey, to your password and everything like work, but they're in the wrong place. You can also do controls to say you're not using networks that you normally use,
mhm,
and and so you can add another level of protection, that is what's going on with respect to networks and what kind of policies do you put around that to flag anomalous behavior, or to really say, hey, if you see these sorts of patterns, now's your time to cut off that access because it's not working to a known pattern that's been approved.
yep.
So you can get very complicated very fast, right?
Well, that's that. I think that's where a lot of our listeners are probably stuck with zero trust. It's so complicated, I can't implement it. So, but there's some basic, simple things that they can focus on first, right?
Yep. Actually, you start with
Yeah.
mapping one workflow, right? Which
Hmm.
is principle number one. It's like take one asset or take one data object and map the workflow to that particular object. That's your basis. So you're going to build zero trust around access to one object, let's just say. And that's an excellent place to start. Then that object has a policy. Then there's going to be a policy enforcement point in front of it. And there's going to be a policy agent and a policy engine that manages the access to that data object through the policy enforcement point. But it all starts with mapping that particular workflow that you're looking to. And that's right out of the guidance from the original Forrester documents, as well as any of the NSA and DoD guidance. That start with one workflow and map that workflow, and that's excellent guidance.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to device security because
Hmm.
we're going to have just so the listeners listen. There's 20 episodes in this series. We're going to have a couple episodes just on identity, just on
Hmm.
device. So we'll have the opportunity to go deep later, which I know we can do it now, but we got to resist the temptation.
Resist the urge.
Yeah. So let's dive into device security. So, what does this mean? Does this just mean I'm locking it in a closet? Physical device security? Does it mean I just keep my malware up? What's the concept behind this?
So that depends
Well,
how deep you want to go in the. This is all going to go back to the policy that you try to enforce for the validity of what accesses the data object or the object that you're protecting, right? So you can require a certain level of device security from a policy perspective. Bless you, Anna. So again, it's going to be one of those roundabout questions that goes back to the policy. So a policy may say you can access this particular object for a period of time based upon your level of device security. You're not up to date on your patches, so you can't access the device. You can't access the web server at all. Let's just say, or you don't have malware protection up to date, so you can only access this particular area of the network. So depending upon the level of security of the device mapped to the policy, you could be restricted to certain areas of access.
Okay, so it's
right.
the same concept with identity, policy management around identity, but now we're
Hmm.
talking about devices. That's what I'm hearing. Is that right?
Very similar, right?
Very similar.
And
It all
well,
goes back to that policy. Sorry, Anna, didn't mean to talk
Yeah,
over
go
you.
ahead, Anna.
no, 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 my fault. So I was just going to say, like, a lot of it is, now you care a whole lot about your, which laptop you're using, right? And is that laptop known to your organization, and can you confirm that it's something that is really allowed to be used, right? And so if you push it even farther, you can say, what was the supply chain behind that device, and do you trust it, and do you trust its manufacturer, and do you have approval from your organization to use that brand of laptop because you have a high degree of assurance that all of the components are what they say they are, and nothing has been injected into that device. And that becomes especially important when you're not just talking about a laptop, but you're talking about, say, a IoT device, right? Is, do you really want to trust that? Because now, even though you're putting all of these policies and checks around, can that really be in my network and involved in my system, right? Those do become entry points. And so locking those down and understanding, not just what kind of data can they handle and how are they interacting with the network and what is their physical location. You do want to know that just fundamentally the hardware is what it's supposed to be, right? So you can get very complicated very fast again. Yeah.
Yeah. So this brings up something interesting that just popped into my mind. I'm a software developer, and security and I have this weird relationship, right? Because anytime I hear security and IT, oh, we have security measures, it just means I got to hop through more things to get my work done. And same thing with device security. Wouldn't it be great if, as a remote worker, which almost everyone is, or hybrid worker now, I can get access to what I need to on my laptop, on my phone, on a tablet. I want that portability to access across multiple devices. But what I'm hearing here is we need to lock down devices tighter. We need to tie those to individuals and tie them to locations. Isn't that going to stymie the flexibility that the hybrid workers are using, and also the IoT world, right? Where now I've got, like in my house, I have 75 devices on my Wi-Fi. That's crazy, right?
That
Because I
is
got
crazy.
IoT all over the place. But I don't have zero trust in my house. I can guarantee you that. Yeah, it's not good.
So, so there's actually a way to deal with that. So if you flip the model and you talk about it from the point of view of the thing that's behind the policy enforcement point, let's talk about the device that's getting access behind the policy enforcement point. The only way that object should be accessed is through the policy enforcement point, right? So the policy enforcement point should be managing the application or the data that is being utilized during that transaction, right? So in a world where you're deploying it with the necessary technologies, the endpoint or the IoT device that's connecting to the policy enforcement point, that's done through an agent. So it should be managed and it should be watched. So you're not actually connecting directly to the asset. You're connecting to
You're going through
from
the
an agent
PEP.
through a PEP only to what's exposed from that particular asset. So you're not connecting to the database directly. You're connecting through what should be an encrypted tunnel through the policy enforcement point. So you shouldn't be accessing it direct. That's the point of microsegmentation, is it's behind a policy enforcement point which manages and monitors the entire transaction session.
Okay, got it. All right, this is helping me out. Now I got to figure out how to do that with all the different vendor IoT devices I have in my home, right? So this is not
Right.
simple. This isn't something I can just turn on, is what I'm hearing.
Well, there's a lot of moving parts. Certain things can be done from the provider side, with certain cloud implementations and things like that. It can push you a certificate. It can say, okay, if you want access to XYZ asset, here, you need to install this certificate. You need to install this agent. And then it does all of those things. So there are things that can be done from the provider and provisioning side to make it easier for an IoT device that doesn't have zero trust technology installed on it to say, all right, install this certificate, install this
Okay.
agent, and then we'll allow you to access these particular assets. That's theoretically one of the strongest selling points, I think, of zero trust, is that kind of methodology, is pushing that agent out and then being able to access whichever things it is you're authorized via policy. Make sense?
Okay, this goes back to the PEP is so important to that trust no one concept and verify continuously. Got it. All right, we need to move on to the next one, which is workload. This one's a little bit more. Is this applications? Is this
It
services?
is.
Anna, kick us off on this one.
Yeah. Yeah. So same thing applies, right? I like who can access your applications and what are your applications doing? What kind of data can they access? I mean, how are they fitting in with the system? This same way you want to, secure your identity and your sources, is you want to know your application can be trusted and hasn't been tampered with as well. So you see the same sorts of controls coming into play. My understanding, and this is Dave, I'd love your comment on this. My understanding is that is one of the more advanced things. Like as a rule, if there's an application out there, we use it. There isn't necessarily a check to say, is the data that's being fed into this application the data that makes sense, and is the result of that application following the known patterns as well? And that's all possible, but I don't know how broadly that's really done yet. But that level of granularity can also add this next level of security too. But
Sure. No, that's a great point. And a lot of times people will use, instead of the word workflow, they'll talk about business flow, the actual business flow of the network. So what does the company do for a living, so to speak? And how is that business conducted on an actual network? What's the workflow? What's the digital workflow of the business, so to speak? So for instance, if it's a financial organization, like it's a bank and they do online banking, the workflow is going to be databases and web servers and things like that, right? So it's mapping that workflow and saying, okay, how are the users, whether they're internal, external, or worldwide, accessing that from a workflow perspective? And then that's where you actually start putting in your zero trust components. All right, I need to put my PEP here. I need to put my policy agents here. I need to put my policy engine here. But it's
Okay,
basically
so
the
the workflow or workload is more of a holistic systems
yeah,
approach, where I'm looking at
absolutely,
it from what are the systems providing, what business value are the systems providing to the business processes. So
basically,
I think this one's a really good one, because I think a lot
yep,
of times I've seen this happen. Even when I was a CIO, we secured we secured all the PCs, right, in all of the laptops, but we didn't secure the whole application stack, right?
that's
So
right.
highly secured individual devices, and people were taking USB keys out the door with all of our intellectual property.
Yep,
You know,
right, and
so we
another
weren't looking at
aspect,
the whole business.
that's exactly
right,
right.
and another aspect of this too is just, does the user, right, or does the person with their device have the right to access that, say, critical application, right? So if most of the systems we work with, right, it's like still a little bit of a walled garden, right? Because once you're in, you have access to everything that is out there. But as you improve, or as you get further down in your maturity curve with respect to the use of zero trust, then that's like no. It's like it should be much tighter than that. It is, does everything match up so that you actually can
Yep,
access this specific application, right? Not just everything that's this class of application, or everything that your
yep,
organization has available. I did want to mention just super quick, right? The expectation around zero trust is not like you turn a key and tomorrow you're zero trust compliant, right? That's why they have the system maturity curve. Is there really is this expectation that this is very much a journey, and like all things in security, it's never ending, right? You don't ever get to say, hey, I'm secure and I'm going to stop doing stuff. But it is like assess your current situation, and then say, where can you really start moving to
yep,
adopt these principles? And so there are going to be multiple stages that you go through. And then kind of falling back on some of the stuff that Steve Warren had charted out when we really early on started talking zero trust is, it's pretty much like you still have to understand what security posture your organization needs. And the first thing you ought to do is say, what's really important to you? Where's your important data? Where are your important applications? What do you really need to have an extremely high level of trust? And where does it maybe not have such an impact? And use that sort of baseline of what's the appropriate level of security for your business, right? And then start applying your zero trust principles based on that, because you can pretty quickly get to hey, here's where we know we really need to tighten up, right? And so we'll start our journey with the focus on, on what you can really do and do today, and then kind of chart out your path to just get more and more stringent with time.
yep.
So,
Okay.
don't be too terrified of it, right? Because
Yeah, no,
it's not a
it's a journey. I like
really.
that. In fact, we have a whole podcast episode in the series on the maturity curve, how to identify where you are, and next steps.
Yeah.
Let's move on, because we've got two more. Well, we got a lot more, and not a lot of time. So, network. This
Keep
is
going.
probably the
Mhm.
where most security people spend all their time, is in the network, right?
Yep.
So this one, it seems to me to be pretty self-evident. How am I connecting? Where am I connecting from?
Yep.
That all those aspects. Does zero trust introduce any fundamentally different things in the network?
I think it brings in more controls of the flows through the network, and I think that's a big deal. So, a switch is a switch, a router is a router, yada, 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 right? But the whole point is how you actually go back to managing that workflow through the network, right? Is where do your policy enforcement points sit relative to that network, right? So which part of my lands are my critical database servers on? And then I put my file. So certain aspects of it are certainly the same. And you just have to learn how to manage it from a zero trust perspective. But and we'll get into this probably in the future. But there's also the zero trust aspect of the network itself, right? What does the network implicitly trust? What does the network implicitly not trust? So, but that's probably best left to a different day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I want to talk just briefly. Does software defined networking really make zero trust much easier to implement because it's not so static anymore? It can be much more dynamic.
Correct. It actually goes a long way toward one of the bigger pillars of zero trust, which is segmentation, right? Which is microsegmentation, which is
Right.
one of the biggest deals and values actually that zero trust brings. And software-defined networks kind of do that by design, right? Yeah, you can manually configure networks through software and stuff like that. So it goes a long way, and I think they're part of a zero trust solution, but they're not the zero trust solution, right? Because you have to be able to enforce policy through that software defined network. It's not just defining the software defined network, but it's managing the policy and the aspect through the software defined network. So they're together, but one doesn't
I'm
necessarily mean
hearing
the
a
other.
common theme in the principles. This PEP is so important.
Yeah.
The policy enforcement point, right? It's so important, and I can leverage that on top of technology that's been around for decades
True.
to manage the security posture of those different things. And I got to keep us moving on because
Hmm.
we'll get stuck. Data is the last of the top five pillars, and then we'll talk about the foundation. So data, is this a new concept? Data access. It seems like it's been around a long time, but we've kind of ignored it for several decades.
Andy, you want to field that one?
So, well, I think Dave's already said this, right? Like much of this is not a new concept, right? What's different about it is really trying to get from like do a single verification and a single understanding that things are okay and move to like how can you actually do the continuous monitoring. But especially with data, right? Data's encryption, right? We've got great systems in place for how you protect your data in motion and your data at rest, right? There is still there's still need for improvements around how are you really protecting your data in use, and that's a bit of a different topic that hopefully is something that we're gonna talk about when we get into the detailed sections on data. But encryption goes a long way towards that, as well as like total memory encryption, and just what's built into your hardware to be able to protect your data when it's flowing over a network. So
So data is not only access; it's also encryption, right? Protection. So
mhm.
I think a lot of times when we think of all these things, we're only thinking about access controls and management. It's also protecting the data, right?
Oh,
Very
So
much so.
absolutely.
all
And
right. So
and
the encryption and duplication of data when I need it, and deduplication of data, and data management. Where is my data? How is got it? Okay.
So, and also, if you turn that on its head and you think about the data when it's at rest. So the data when it's at rest in a database server or a whatever server, right? And how is access to that managed and protected? That's where, again, we go back to that policy enforcement point. So if you think about that, if the only way I'm exposing access to my data through a database server is managed through that policy enforcement point, that goes a long way to data security. And then you have how we secure the data when it's at rest in the server itself, right? So you've got multiple levels there. So you've got the policy enforcement management, which is not allowing any access to that particular asset, no matter except for the one application that's authorized. But then the data itself can be protected at rest through encryption and a lot of other things. So I would advise people to look at it both ways, right? Is
Both
how
ways.
is it
Got it.
served out, and then how is it secured at rest?
All right, cool. All right, let's move to the next pillar, which is really a foundation. It has 5 aspects to it. And this was just recently added this year, probably only 2 months ago, right? Isn't that SIS added the 6th pillar, um, which consists of visualization and analytics,
Hmm.
automation and orchestration, and the third one, governance.
Yep.
This is interesting that they added this, that it wasn't in the original.
Well, don't
Any
forget sorry, Darren, didn't mean to jump on
No,
you
go
there.
ahead.
So the original workings of Zero Trust come from the Forrester Group, and I believe his last name is Kinderberg, right? And he talked about it from the point of view of architecture in how do you build a network that's resilient, you're not trusting anything, and you're verifying things. And I think in the original specs, when he originally talked about it, continuous monitoring was not terminology that was in there, and analytics were not necessarily terminology that was in there. And that's actually probably the one of the most key points to Zero Trust from my particular perspective, because that's where you get the continual authorization from, right? You log in and you're given a token that gives you a certain amount of access, but it's that continual monitoring and analytic and governance portion that is the power of it. Otherwise, it's static policies and you just have a firewall. Again, I was
Yeah,
given
yeah,
access.
exactly.
So I would actually say the addition of the monitoring aspect, the analytical aspect, and the governance aspect actually makes Zero Trust applicable, and in ways it may not have actually been originally conceived to be applicable, because otherwise it would have just been a static architecture unless you're doing continual monitoring and continual analytics. It's
Okay,
hugely
that
important.
that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Because it makes it implementable, the
Better
the
word.
the concepts,
Better word.
and like you said, to do continuous monitoring, to switch out tokens, to make things more dynamic, you have to do it. I also love how in the end they talk about governance, because a lot of times we just throw technology and say, "Hey, zero trust is all about technology." We know that's not true. Embracing digital transformation is all about people, process, and then technology. So the governance side to me really says, hey, we've got to change our process. We've got to change our policies in how we do things in our company. It's a philosophical change as well as a technology change. So I like the foundation. To me, it makes it real.
No,
So
that's
Well, and it
true.
puts it up in a way that it becomes doable at scale, right?
yeah.
Is
It's funny. Zero Trust is probably more about middleware than it is almost anything else, right? It's about a lot of disparate technologies and vendors having to work together to embrace a larger
mhm.
quote unquote solution, or an ever moving paradigm, right? Because it's not just, you can't buy a Zero Trust solution. Don't work. It's none out there. Zero.
Wait. Some vendors have already approached me saying that they have a zero trust
It's
solution
all
that will
magic.
solve all my
Single
zero
dashboard.
trust problems.
Single dashboard, right? Um,
Yeah.
but the truth is, there's many vendor implementations that address aspects of Zero Trust. You have the identity aspect of Zero Trust. That has to work in conjunction with the policy enforcement point aspect of Zero Trust, which has to work with the policy agent, which has to work with monitoring, which has to work with
Right,
SOAR.
right, right, right.
So in the end, what you have to do is you have to embrace the middleware concept, because it all has to work together. If portions of it are not utilizing the identity aspect of it, you got a problem.
Right, right.
If portions of it aren't using the microsegmentation properly, you've got a problem. So you have to embrace how they work together to address the larger problem of Zero Trust.
Okay, so this is awesome. It gave me a better understanding of how this all fits together. For our listeners, you're going to be hearing from Dave and Anna again several times in these 20 episodes. There'll be that common thread to we're bringing in several vendors in the identity, workforce, device, workload, network, orchestration, all these different pillars. We'll be bringing in several vendors that have solutions in these space. And the common thread will be, how do we tie these all together in some high level architectures, and that's where Anna and Dave are going to really tie everything together for us.
Yeah, and do you mind if I ask Dave a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah. So as we're talking through all of this, what this sounds like to me is zero trust implementations are going to be custom, right? Based on what the organization's needs are, and that they are going to involve multiple software vendors that will each have aspects that are critical for making sure that you've got all of the pillars covered, right? I mean, that sounds like that's what our customers can expect, or what our listeners can expect when they're really going down this path. Is there will be some complexity because they can't just go out of the box with something, and they'll need to do their own prioritization as well as work within the vendors that they like and trust, but also the ones that can provide all of the elements that they have and will work with each other, right, so that they get what they want. So this is going to be a fun series, Darren. So I
I
that to
think
be
so
more of
too.
a question than it was, but
No, I
Dave's
look
been
forward to
nodding,
it.
so I think that's correct.
No,
So,
and is absolutely right. It comes down to they all have to work together to embrace a larger problem, and the problem is multi-vendor by definition, or the solution rather is multi-vendor by definition.
well, that's the problem too.
I don't know.
Multi-vendor, because we can get in that another episode where people don't
How to
stay
get
in their
everyone to work
lane.
together.
So, hey
No,
guys, thanks for coming on today, and I look forward to the mini discussions we're going to have over the next 20 weeks.
Agreed. Thanks for setting up this series, Darren. This is great.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and do something wonderful.